So, why did we say conflicts were bad for teams? Well, there are many reasons to avoid dysfunctional conflicts. Dysfunctional conflicts ruin team morale. That means, lower motivation, and less effort. Plus, when team members reduce effort, new conflicts may happen on this basis. People might start pointing fingers at each other, accusing each other of free riding. Conflicts overshadow leaders, and diminish their authority. Even if a leader is not directly involved in the conflict. That's because leaders have responsibility. People expect leaders to maintain legitimate order in a group. In conflicts, people often consider the other side illegitimate, and they expect the leader to react. Eventually, low morale, reduced effort, low focus on the task, all together lead to poor quality of work, and low efficiency. Let's see now, how conflicts can be resolved. There are 5 classical approaches of conflict resolution. First, let's have an overview of these approaches. After that, we will see when using these approaches is appropriate, or inappropriate. The first approach, that you can take, is avoiding, or retreating from a conflict. This means, ignoring an issue, pretending that no issue exists, leaving the issue to resolve itself. Alternatively, you can give in. That is, you accept your opponent's terms, or point of view, or whatever is the subject of the conflict. This approach is called accommodating. The third approach is compromising. To attain a compromise, you need to negotiate. For instance, you might need to give up on some points that are of minor importance to you. But you stand your ground when it comes to important points. While a compromise sometimes works as a quick fix, a quick agreement, that generally satisfies all parties, there might be a solution to a conflict, that would satisfy all parties fully. Searching for, and working towards such a win-win solution requires more close cooperation, than a negotiation. It also requires more time and motivation of all the stakeholders. On the other hand, cooperation, negotiation, collaboration are not imperative. Simply forcing the other party to accept your conditions, standing your ground no matter what, taking a categorical and principled stance, is an option too. Okay, now let's take a closer look at each of these 5 approaches. The first approach is ignoring a conflict, or retreating from it, and leaving the issue to resolve itself. As you can imagine, this approach is not always desirable, and not always possible. But in certain situations it is a good choice. For example, you can use this approach if the issue is very minor, if it is not worth your time. What issues do we call minor? You can think of the issues as minor, or major, in terms of the stake and the people involved. What do I have to lose or win in this situation? Is it important? This is the stake. And think about the importance of the other side this way. Should I be concerned by what this people feel? What they think of me? Do I depend on them? Will I ever deal with them again? It is a good idea to ignore a conflict, when the people involved are too emotional, when the dispute is too heated. Sometimes, you need to let the situation cool down first, and then you can get back to the issue when the moment is more favorable. You can safely avoid a conflict, if you know that the issue will disappear naturally after some time. For example, people are more prone to conflict, under stress, when the time is tight, for example when the deadline is approaching, when resources are scarce. So, sometimes, it is better to avoid conflicts that are induced by stress, because these conflicts will disappear, together with the stress. It is also recommended to avoid conflicts when you have limited information on the issue. You don't know who is right, who is wrong, who is misled. The other side, or yourself, might be building arguments on wrong assumptions. So, you need time to gather more information, and establish understanding of the issue. Avoiding conflicts is not appropriate, if the issue is in the area of your responsibility. For example, you cannot ignore a conflict with your subordinates in most of cases. Or, a conflict among your subordinates. In fact, there are so many circumstances, under which avoiding and withdrawing from a conflict is not an option. Let's say, if a conflict is likely to entail negative consequences if ignored, ethical, reputational, professional, and so on, it shouldn't be ignored. The next approach is smoothing, or accommodating. That is when you give more concerns to the other parties than to yours. You try to avoid tough discussion, and focus on the points of agreement, rather than on your interest. You accept the other side's conditions, if necessary. Smoothing and accommodation is an appropriate approach to conflict resolution, in case if the issue is rather minor, just like in the case of avoiding approach. But also, if the other side in the conflict is either very important to you, so that you'd rather not risk the relationship, or the other party is more powerful than you, so that you cannot do much to stand for your interest, because your bargaining power is relatively low. Logically, this approach is not appropriate when the interest at stake is more important than the relationship, or when such behavior can damage your reputation and leadership. For example, when kindness and flexibility might be interpreted as weakness, and motivate attempts to take advantage of you. Compromising is when all the sides of a conflict are motivated to reach a mutually agreed solution. Usually, it is done through a negotiation. The sides have to agree, what interests will they need to give up, and what do they gain. Compromising is a good strategy when all sides need to win. For example, when stakes are high, or the issue is a zero-sum game issue. Zero-sum means that somebody has to lose in any case. For example, if the issue is who gets a promotion, both sides cannot win, because there is only one person to be promoted. In such case, the sides should be motivated to negotiate. On the other hand, the sides need to be motivated to negotiate in order to reach a compromise. Compromise is only possible if none of the parties involved is able to enforce its conditions on the other side. There should be an equilibrium of power between the sides. Otherwise, one of the sides will simply enforce its interest on the other. Besides, sometimes people are simply not willing to negotiate, regardless of their interest and bargaining position. Collaboration is an approach to conflicts when all the parties involved work on a single solution that would fully satisfy everybody. In other words, collaboration is a problem-solving approach when the parties involved in a conflict decide to not be on different sides anymore, and join their efforts toward a shared goal. This approach is possible, and recommended, when a consensus is required. For example, a board of directors of a company have to agree on the strategy of the company, because otherwise they cannot implement it together. The United Nations Security Council has to agree on a resolution, because otherwise, members can use their right for veto. Sometimes, it is in everybody's interest to join forces, instead of negotiating, because the problem is complex, and requires multiple points of view, various expertise. For example, when competitors unite against a common and larger enemy, or against environmental forces, such as a crisis or a natural catastrophe. Collaboration is the best way to reach a long-term sustainable agreement, when the sides know that they will be dealing with each other in the future. However, collaboration is not attainable if there is no time available for it, if the issue is urgent. Otherwise, parties might not be willing to collaborate for different reasons, such as lack of understanding of the issue, poor communication, and any irrational behavior, such as stubbornness. Finally, you may decide to enforce your will on the other side. This is a win-lose situation, opposite to the lose-win situation, as in case of the accommodation approach. This approach is appropriate to use only if all of the following conditions are satisfied. Quick solution is needed. Stakes are high. The relationship with the stakeholders involved is not important. You have sufficient power to do so. Otherwise, this approach is not recommended. One should be particularly discouraged to use this approach if the relationship with the other side is important. So, to conclude, when you decide on a conflict resolution approach, you should take into consideration several factors. First, is the relationship with the stakeholders important to you or not? Second, the issue. Is it major or minor? If the relationship is important, you should firstly consider smoothing or collaborating approach. If the stakeholders are negligible, you may consider avoiding or enforcing approach. Compromising, obviously, is an intermediate option. If the stakes of the issue are very important, forcing or collaborating approach are more appropriate. However, relationship and goals are not the only two factors to consider. You should also take into consideration whether a short-term or a long-term solution is needed, whether you have power, time, and capacity to implement a given approach. There is also ethics, the other party's motivation, and many other factors. After watching this video, You should answer the quiz questions right below the video. Good luck with that.